Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Today we'll be talking about what's been unfolding in Afghanistan. The U.S. military has confirmed that 2 U.S. soldiers, they've been killed and 6 others wounded when an individual in Afghan army uniform opened fire on them with a machine gun in Nangarhar province in eastern Afghanistan. And this incident took place on Saturday evening. Now, Colonel Sunny Liggett, a spokesman for the U.S. forces in Afghanistan, he's come out and said that the cause or the motive behind this attack is not immediately known. Investigation is going on at the moment. The details that we do have at this moment are incomplete at best, with initial reports suggesting there was an altercation between a small U.S. team, a U.S. Special Operations Forces team, and Afghan troops on the ground there that led to this shootout. Now, this comes at a critical time of this 18-year war where the U.S. President Donald Trump has been eager to pull out forces as he campaigns for the presidential elections of 2020 there in the United States. Now, there are currently somewhere around 13 to 14,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan at the moment. Now, we will be talking to our guests how the nature of this attack in itself can affect a very fragile peace talk ongoing between the U.S. and the Afghan Taliban. And we also want to look a little deeper into the nature of this attack, whether we could consider it an insider attack and how, or whether this is a Taliban infiltration incident within the Afghan security forces. All that and more we'll be discussing with our guests. Let me introduce who is to today. We have with us Mr. Ahmad Murid Partaw, a former representative of the U.S. Central Command on Afghanistan. He's joining us today from Florida. And we also have Mr. Fazal Muzhary, an analyst, a senior researcher with Afghanistan Analysis Network, joining us today from Kabul. Mr. Fazal Muzhary, if I can begin with you. Mr. Fazal, the nature, of course, we want to get to. But first off, do you think that this could in any way affect the U.S.-Afghan Taliban peace talks underway at the moment?
Thank you. To talk about the nature of the attack, it happened in military in the district center of Sherzad district when the Americans and these commando forces were together there. They had been there on an operation. When the Afghan man who was informed in military uniforms and he was part of the commando, he opened fire on the American forces. And in the initial, there were reports were suggesting that there were 8 or 6 people killed.
Right.
Till that is the recent release of the confirmation of two bodies announced by the Americans confirmed that there were 2 and 6 others were wounded. But still, we will wait if the number increases or not.
Mr. Fazal, let me get Mr. Ahmad's take on this as well. Mr. Ahmad, there have been insider attacks. That is not something new. It's not unprecedented. In fact, it's been a common feature through this 18-year war. In fact, data reveals that 2007 to 2016, there have been over 157 NATO personnel who have died as a result of these deaths and 557 members of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. Now, this comes at a time where, of course, negotiations are underway once again. Earlier on, President Trump called off negotiations in September as a result of a U.S. soldier being killed, which Taliban later took responsibility for the attack. Do you see this agreement right now becoming more volatile than it already is as a result of this incident?
Well, as you mentioned, these incidents are not uncommon in the context of the Afghan war. You know, we have seen this kind of incidents before. I think it was 2011 when these green on blue attacks, came at their peak when Afghan soldiers were turning against their advisors or against their mentors, in this case, mostly American mentors. But this incident that has occurred 2 days ago in Nangarhar province, this also seems to be as we have information that the gunman was wearing an Afghan military uniform and was subsequently killed in the gunfire between the Afghan and U.S. forces. But I don't think, as the Afghan Ministry of Defense has announced, that these kind of attacks have any negative impact on the nature of the mission, because you have many of these clearing and security operations going on in a joint partnership between Afghan commandos and U.S. Special Operation Forces. But right now, from what we are hearing, based on open source intelligence, that there is a commission by the Afghan military, a combined commission actually by the U.S.-Afghan military, that is investigating this incident. So details are going to be made once the investigation.
Right. There's a lot of obviously speculation at the moment because the details have not yet surfaced. There's like you mentioned, a commission been assigned and they're investigating the incident. But Mr. Fazal, if you could just talk a little on how there could be a motivation and what that motivation really could be, in your opinion, of Afghan National Defense and Security Forces possibly turning onto the foreign troops on the ground, the coalition forces. What, in your opinion, are the reasons, the underlying factors that motivate them?
Well, the actual motivation is hard to know, because the person who did this is already dead. So it is hard to find. There is no way of investigation for that. But this had been common, and as Ahmad also mentioned, in 2011, 12, and 13. So back and forth. I think the motivation, it is hard to say what exactly it is, but there are different reasons. For example, we hear from the media civilian casualties, air bombing and air strikes, drone strikes in different parts of the country. So this can also have psychological effects on some other parts of the country as well. So I insist that it is difficult to know, but it's
difficult to know clearly because the person who was behind the attack has been killed as a result of this shootout also. But Mr. Ahmad, is there a possibility that, because it seems more a reality now that with this agreement with the US, that when the troops withdraw, it seems more real, the possibility that the Taliban on the ground will have much more political sway, and as a result, those right now with the government or as troops or security personnel are concerned for their future?
Well, I think it will not have an impact on the U.S. Taliban talks as they are being continued in Qatar, because this is an indirect attack. And the motive is unknown so far. There could be a lot of reasons behind these kind of attacks, from personal personal hatred to misbehaving of an individual, to penetration of the Taliban or Afghani network, to miscommunication and misperception of an individual, who was working with the coalition forces. So there are different reasons for green on blue attacks. But this one particularly is unknown, as I mentioned, until we hear from this commission, joint commission, which is, I believe, a senior Afghan general at the lieutenant level who is heading the commission. So we will be hearing shortly more in the coming days that what happened exactly, but I don't think that it will have a major impact on the U.S. Taliban talks in Qatar. As I mentioned, these are single, incidents. Afghanistan is a big country. These kind of incidents will continue to occur. So it will not have because this is not a direct attack by the Taliban.
Right. It seems like it was an altercation. It seems like there was an altercation. These incidents in the past has been assessed by various reports from NATO itself and other organizations on the ground. They have talked about how there are reasons such as cultural differences, personal enmity, something that you even talked about here. But what concerns many analysts at the moment is that back in 2012, when these attacks went back up, the number of such attacks where the Afghan forces were turning on their foreign troops, the coalition forces. Mullah Omar, the then leader of the Taliban, came out and said that the Taliban have created what they call the Call and Guidance, Luring and Integration Department, which has branches all across Afghanistan. Mr. Fazal, is your concern that though the Taliban hasn't yet taken responsibility, that this it kind of reflects on the kind of mistrust that exists between coalition forces and Afghan security forces?
This peace talks, I think from the Taliban side, the most focus is on the peace talks in Qatar, and they are insisting or continuously working for the success of this peace talks. So they are also not mostly focusing on infiltration like this or operations, but the focus is on reducing the violence. So that is one side. The issue of the trust is also questionable, but we cannot call it mistrust, because you may not remember, you may not heard it in the news, but yesterday there was one brother killing another brother at a senior level. For example, the son of one of the deputy of the chief executive, his son came and he killed his brother. So these kind of incidents are happening because of psychological problems and other problems, post-trauma disorders, and these kind of issues that can affect. But it is not to say that there is a mistrust between the Afghan and the U.S. soldiers. There have been this kind of attacks from time to time. So that have different reasons, I would say.
You think there are different reasons. Now, of course, in a region which has seen war for 18 years, those right now employed in the services of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, that they are not alien to that kind of environment. It is understandable that they would be carrying such trauma with them, having seen nothing but war. So, Mr. Ahmad, my concern really is that back in 2014, when President Obama had announced a similar sort of withdrawal of troops in Afghanistan, again, such attacks went back up. Do you see any correlation between that and now that we've seen this incident? Earlier on, we saw a helicopter being down, which was again speculated that was from the Taliban. Of course, that was not acknowledged by them. But do you see a correlation between troop withdrawal and such attacks going up?
I don't think that the Taliban will intensify their operations at this moment because they are engaged right now politically with the United States and to some extent with the Afghan government. So all demands are made right now to reduce violence in Afghanistan and across Afghanistan. So I don't think that this will be the strategy of the Taliban at this particular moment to intensify their attacks on coalition forces or Afghan forces, because both sides are demanding the Taliban to reduce violence, so that could lead to a broader negotiation and eventually an intra-Afghan dialogue in the future. But these kind of single incidents, as you pointed out, may continue. As I mentioned, we don't know the motive yet. But the strategy of the Taliban, I don't think, would be to increase their attacks because right now they are actively engaging with the United States and Afghan government to come up with a political agreement in order to end the Afghan conflict.
Okay, and so we've come to a conclusion with both of you feeling that the Taliban are committed right now with the U.S. Afghan Taliban talks that are taking place. Seems like they're very close to an agreement being finalized. And here on the ground, we continue to see skirmishes. We saw the U.S. helicopter being down. 2 U.S. soldiers lost their lives in that. There was a 10-hour delay before the U.S. troops could reach the location of the helicopter because it was in the Taliban stronghold where that happened. And this incident, a close second. Mr. Fazal, if I could get your closing comments on this in terms of the kind of environment being created, if the Taliban are committed to seeing a ceasefire, to seeing an agreement be finalized? Can it be reasonably expected that any kind of de-escalation would have a longer-term timeline than a short-term?
I think, yes, there is a hope for a longer time de-escalation of war because we already see there is not major attacks happening from the Taliban side in major parts of the country. There are attacks on Afghan security forces in rural areas, not in the major areas like in Kabul or other major cities. There are small clashes, skirmishes going on from time to time. On the government side, there is also airstrikes, night raids going on. But in the longer run, I think we are expecting a much reduced de-escalation of violence as a whole, as part of the peace process is going ahead. One thing to say about this mistrust between Afghan and American forces, I would say I don't think there is a mistrust to connect to this incident. This is mostly personal issues, not as a whole the issue of mistrust. So I cannot say that it is a part of a mistrust between the Afghan and foreign forces.
It's not a part of a mistrust. Now, Mr. Ahmad, could get your closing comments while also adding here that back in May 2012, the then ISAF Commander General John Allen, he talked about these insider attacks, and he said then 50% of the attacks on the coalition troops were as a result of Taliban infiltrators within the Afghan National Army and the Defense Security Forces. You seeing this moving forward as the peace talks continue, do you see a longer-term solution, a longer-term ceasefire happening here between the Taliban and the coalition forces on the ground?
Yes. I think when General Allen made those comments, I was at U.S. Central Command, and I was working very closely with U.S. officials, on how to reduce these attacks. That was in a particular time, 2011, 2012, and the Taliban relied on this strategy to create mistrust between the Afghan security forces and the coalition. And to some extent, they were successful on that. And as a result, many soldiers, U.S. and Afghan soldiers lost their life. Right. So in that particular time, this was the strategy of the Taliban, which they heavily relied on because they had lost a lot of territory and they were in a very, very weakening position. But right now, time has changed. Right now, as I mentioned, U.S. Taliban are actively talking peace, and to some extent, the Afghan government is also involved. So both sides, in this case, the Afghan and the U.S. Parties are demanding the Taliban to reduce the violence first, so that this reduction of violence will create the environment for an intra-Afghan dialogue, first to a peace agreement, and then to a intra-Afghan dialogue between the Afghan Taliban and the Afghan government. Right. I think that's not the prospect for peace are not far at this moment, because as my colleague was mentioning, we don't see a lot of attacks from the Taliban across the country, especially on urban cities. So right now, both sides
seem to be committed to the idea of a prolonging peace in the region and a step forward towards intra-Afghan peace talks there also. Well, we've run out of time. Mr. Ahmad and Mr. Fazal, thank you so much for joining us here on Newswire. We take a quick short break, and when we're back, we take a look at whether or not the deal of the century by President Trump is gathering any traction. Welcome back to Newswire. Now, early Monday morning, we saw Israeli forces attacking Hamas positions from the air after militants in the Palestinian enclave fired a projectile at southern Israel on a Sunday night. Now, this airstrike comes at a time where there has been a bit of an uptick on the crossfire between the two. We have seen Palestinian attacks increase since January 28th, the day that the U.S. President Donald Trump released his proposal for resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, something that he has been calling the deal of the century. Now, condemnations against President Trump's proposal for peace between Israel and Palestine, they've been gathering. And at the same time, we've seen just recently the Organization of Islamic Countries, the OIC, saying that Washington's Middle East plan is the result of U.S.'s intellectual bankruptcy, as they've termed it, as well as how the U.S. and Israel have had aspirations for the region, which are completely alien to what the Palestinians want. Now, we will be talking about this, but also including in this conversation a bit of a surprising twist when we saw that the U.S. warned Israel over the weekend against declaring sovereignty over the land in West Bank without Washington's nod. How can this be interpreted, especially at the time when Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is just a few weeks away from the third snap elections to take place in the past year? Now, with this, let me introduce who will be speaking. We have with us Mr. Emmanuel Navon, an analyst. He's joining us from Efrat, south of Jerusalem. Welcome to Newswire. Mr. Navon, let's start with the latest on this attack that took place Sunday night. One projectile made it. As a result, airstrikes from Israeli forces. This uptick, how do you interpret it at a time? Is it going to affect the kind of traction that the deal of the century really needs at this moment for this conversation to move forward from the Palestinians as well on how peace can be brought to this region?
Well, actually, the deal of the century is trying to reunite, to unite, not to reunite, because they were never united, the West Bank with the Gaza Strip via a tunnel. So the deal of the century is actually trying to create some political unity between the two territories, which does not currently exist. The deal of the century also calls for the removal of Hamas and terrorist jihad from the Gaza Strip and to return the territory to the Palestinian Authority, which, according to the plan, is supposed to become a Palestinian state eventually. But for this to happen, according to the deal submitted by President Trump, the Palestinian Authority has to reimpose its rule on that territory instead of Hamas, which took it by force in 2007.
Well, that is debatable because there were elections that took which they won. But just on that point that you're saying that Hamas needs to be and Palestinian Islamic Jihad needs to remove, I went through the proposal. In the terms that it used was disarming Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad to get their word on de-escalating to allow a peaceful process, not to completely ban them.
Well, actually, I also read the deal of the century, the 181 pages. I read it carefully, and from what I understand, the document actually calls for removing Hamas's rule from the Gaza Strip. But whether or not the actual term in the document is removal or disarmament, one has to understand that if we're talking about a peace agreement, about a political agreement, Hamas rejects such agreement with Israel regardless of Israel's borders. And therefore, it is an oxymoron to talk about a peace agreement with Hamas because Hamas itself says it openly in its founding document that it denies and refuses any dealing with Israel. So I do not know how we can have a political agreement with an organization that denies Israel's very right to exist.
Right. Now that the Organization of Islamic Countries, they came out with this meeting, the statement after an executive committee meeting where the Secretary General came out and said that the Muslim countries must unite against this plan. What is your interpretation of how this could impede any kind of progress if there was some to be expected on this?
Well, the reality is that behind those official statements, there are different voices without the Arab world and within the Muslim world. There is actually a divide with countries such as Iran and its proxies in the region that lead the opposition not only to the deal but also to the United States and to Israel in general. On the other hand, you have countries that are much closer to Israel and to the U.S., such as Jordan, such as Egypt, two countries which have in fact, a peace agreement with Israel. By the way, now it also includes Sudan. Who would have thought? A country whose leader met with Israel's prime minister a week ago in Uganda. So behind those official statements, there are actually many different voices and different stances within the Arab world and within the Muslim world.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of official statements, in a tweet, when the U.S. ambassador to Tel Aviv, David Friedman, he talked about how the Israeli-American committee must complete their mapping process before any kind of steps are taken, and he's referring to Prime Minister Netanyahu's statement on, moving well ahead of the plan and the annexation of West Bank. What is your take on that?
So basically, last week there were the different voices coming from the Trump administration, where David Friedman, whom you mentioned, had basically said that Israel could start moving ahead with annexations, and then Jared Kushner, the main author of the document, and the son-in-law and advisor of the president on that project, said otherwise. And he said, no, first we have to see how things are going to move on, whether or not the Palestinian Authority is going to meet the criteria of the document and negotiate with Israel. And then, of course, we need the Israeli elections to pass and see if there's going to be a stable and functioning Israeli government. And now basically David Friedman is aligning himself with that, which means basically that first that the Trump administration is determined to implement this deal, and then it will see if the Palestinians really refuse completely to negotiate, then maybe the Trump administration will let Israel move ahead with part of the deal.
No, but because earlier Prime Minister Netanyahu, he promised that there would be speedy application of Israeli law to Jewish settlement blocks, and this was the response that any kind of, that Ambassador Friedman said, unilateral action would effectively endanger the plan.
Right, because the plan talks about mutual annexations. Everybody talks about the Israeli annexations in the plan, but the plan also talks about Palestinian annexations within pre-67 Israel. And that includes significant territories in the desert Negev at the border with Egypt, but also significant territory in the Judean desert, south of the grid line in the West Bank. And those mutual annexations would basically compensate the annexation that Israel would do within the West Bank. So the plan talks very clearly about mutual annexations, at the end of which the size of Israel and the West Bank and Gaza would be, the size of the West Bank and Gaza after those Palestinian annexations would be fairly similar, and that is the terms used by the plan, to the size of those two territories before 1967.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Emmanuel Navon, joining us there with his analysis. Let me welcome one more guest who will be speaking to us on this. Dr. Basem Naim is just joining us. He's a spokesperson for Hamas. He's joining us from Gaza. Dr. Naim, the situation, let's start from right at the top. The kind of projectile that launched on Sunday night, the response was sirens, air raid sirens, thousands rushing to bomb shelters. And as a result, on Monday early morning, airstrikes by the Israeli Air Force. What can you tell us about this attack that was spurred on by a projectile on Sunday night?
The situation in Gaza is well known for many people around the world. It is a catastrophic, dire humanitarian crisis. Here, living 2 million people living under Israeli siege with all kinds of oppressions and embargo and boycott. The living conditions are really catastrophic.
Right.
It didn't start with people responded to the Israeli airstrikes. The Israelis last week, they have bombarded many civilian areas along the whole Gaza Strip, and they are asking the Palestinians to be oppressed, besieged, boycotted, and we keep in context the announcement of the so-called American New Peace Plan.
Right. No, but
in the background. All of these. peace.
Can you confirm the
things.
nature? Can you confirm the nature of the projectile? Because while it is understood far and wide that the Palestinian leadership, both in West Bank and Gaza, have rejected the peace plan by President Trump, the kind of escalation in violence that a projectile leads to, at the end of the day, the price paid by the highest price paid by, is by those living in Gaza.
Look, we are already paying the highest price from our life, our daily life. 2 million people are kept hostages for now more than 14 years, with or without these projectiles. We are besieged. Second, this is our guaranteed right to by all means, political, diplomatic, and legal means, including armed resistance.
Right.
Israel is an occupying power. Israel must be responsible for its acts here on the ground as an occupying power, must be responsible for the life of 2 million people here and also in the other Palestinian territories. Therefore, Palestinians cannot keep silent and dying in peace. We have the right to resist this oppression.
You have the right to resist this oppression, sure. But let me come back to you there, Dr. Naim. Stay with us. Let me welcome here Mr. Muslim Imran, an analyst joining us from Kuala Lumpur. Mr. Imran, my question essentially, what I was trying to direct here to Dr. Naim, was that at a time where the world is split between whether they back the peace proposal for Israel and Palestine and whether they don't, because the OIC came out in a strongly worded statement, talked about the kind of relations that the US and Israel has, the aspirations they have for this region, and hence the convoluted peace plan. But at a time like this, when projectiles are launched, whether the nature of the projectile is equivalent to a firecracker, the problem is that the response it gets not only sort of vindicates the Israelis to go ahead with their proposal that they are fighting off terrorists, aka Hamas, aka Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It also puts into question whether it is conducive for the those living in Gaza in the West Bank.
You see, Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza for tens of years before the Palestinians could think of projectiles or any form of attacks from the Gaza Strip to Israel. So the problem did not start with Palestinians resisting occupation. It started with occupation. Right. We have to look at the root cause of the conflict. The root cause is that Israel is a colonial project imposed over the Palestinians. It's a remnant of colonialism. I don't think of any similar example about Israel. And Palestinians have to resist it. We have no choice but to resist occupation. Otherwise, our very existence is denied. Now, what President Trump is announcing to the world is a mockery of peace. He brings over one side of the conflict and designs a plan which suits only this right-wing, self-centered Zionist leaders and talks to the world about peace. Peace should happen between two sides. Right. You can't announce in the United States a plan for the Palestinians and the Israelis while the Palestinians are denied input and are absent and their rights are completely undermined. What this peace proposal, this deal of the century is proposing is the annihilation of Palestinian existence. No Palestinian, no sane individual in this world can accept the denial of the existence of one side because the other side is too powerful. Right. Trump is trying to repeat what has happened in North America when the Red Indians were wiped out of the map of North America. We won't let this happen. No Palestinian will let this happen. And the world is not split over this plan.
Right, but would you say that... Mr. Imran, would you say then that the effect, if anything, has been achieved by this proposal? Because at the end of the day, it is but a proposal by the US, and it is absolutely no secret to the world what US's bias is when it comes to Israel. But would you say at least it got the conversation started once again in light of the kind of partiality that exists when mediators step in to try and resolve Israel and the Palestine conflict?
I believe this plan is isolating the U.S. From the rest of the world. Well, Trump's foreign policy has been a disaster. He has recorded a lot of failures in North Korea, in relations with Iran, and now in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The U.S. is, under Trump's leadership, is becoming more isolated. You see, the world, the OIC, the Arab League, the European Union, the different international actors have been condemning this deal of the century.
But at the
US
same
is
time,
committing
you
a big
see
mistake by
countries that should have been sympathetic to the Palestinian cause and have historically been so, have sided or indicated that they are open to relations with Israel. We just saw what has transpired between the leader of Sudan and meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu in Uganda.
These people are representing regimes that are looking for survival. They don't represent or reflect the international will. The Sudanese current military regime does not represent the will of the Palestinian people. But look at democratic nations. Look at the European Union. Look at Malaysia. Look at Turkey. Look at the rest of the OIC member states. They've all
been very critical. Also, Mr. Imran, let me mention here that at a time when Prime Minister Netanyahu is looking for the kind of support he badly needs before the March elections, the third snap elections in a year's time, we've also seen the U.S. ambassador to Tel Aviv talk about that Israel shouldn't maybe get too far ahead of itself, saying that anything that any declaring sovereignty over the West Bank land can endanger the kind of support the U.S. has been giving.
Exactly. Now, Israel is misusing the American support. The U.S. has been supporting the Israeli narrative and the Israeli policy, but not to the extent that Israel expects. Now, Trump has given a higher dose of the kind of American support to the right-wing narrative in Israel. This is very toxic, and this is going to cause more conflict. It's antagonizing the Palestinians. It's alienating their basic rights, and it's going to cause a big backlash. But trust me, the international community is aware of what's happening. Yesterday, a big international conference was concluded here in Kuala Lumpur, where hundreds of members of parliament from over 70 countries across the globe condemned the deal of the century and condemned the American bias towards Israel and called for an end to Israeli occupation and an end to Israeli apartheid. All these terms were mentioned in the resolution of this conference. So the world is unhappy for what's happening in Palestine, and they're backing the Palestinian side against this apartheid regime.
Right, Mr. Imran there. Thank you so much for joining us from Kuala Lumpur with this analysis on whether or not the peace talks could gather, the proposal by the U.S. could gather any traction here. Coming back to you, Dr. Basem Naim, the issue about the tweet that the U.S. Ambassador David Friedman did when he talked about that the possibility that this unilateral action that Israel is looking to take on annexation of land in the West Bank, that this could endanger essentially the plan itself and also the kind of American recognition Washington has offered so far. What do you make of this tweet?
Look, Ayza, the U.S. ambassador to Palestine or to what's so-called Israel is more Zionist than the Zionists themselves, and he is planning for more annexion of land and Judaization of Jerusalem and keeping Jerusalem united as the capital of Israel. But now he have seen the response, the international response in Europe, in Asia, in different countries, and the people around. Therefore, he is looking how to keep this plan viable to be implemented maybe after the election, where we have a strong Israeli government and backed up by the Americans. Especially, we know that the Americans now in the election campaigns for the next period. I don't think that he is thinking of the interests of Palestinians or how to revise this plan to be more just for Palestinian rights. It is more, again, thinking of how to support the Israelis, even against their right-wing groups who are eager to implement this plan as soon as possible. And he knows that this will cause even their allies in the region, some Arabic countries, some Islamic countries who are supporting hidden this plan, that this will not make them more troubles.
Right. So you're saying, Dr. Naim, you're saying it's almost as if Friedman is trying to buy some more time here because the Israeli elections are a few weeks away, and that we've already got President Trump mired in his own domestic dispute with the 2020 election. campaign ongoing. But let me get your take on this. The OIC, they had an executive meeting and they spoke about this extraordinary open-ended executive committee meeting where the Secretary General came out and said that this is the time where Muslim countries must unite against the plan. We had Mr. Navon, an analyst, join us earlier. He talked about saying that the OIC meeting, the statement that came out of it was at the end of the day just a statement, and the Arab world is pretty supportive of the peace plan. What is your interpretation of this OIC statement?
No, it is not only just a statement. Okay, we are looking for more actions than words. We are looking for more practical support for the Palestinian rights in the Arabic countries, in the Islamic countries, at the international level. And we see that this is not enough. But at the same time, I think it is reflecting how these regimes or how these countries are under pressure from their own people. We see activities all over the world, in the North Africa, in the Arabic countries, in some Islamic countries, even in Europe and in America, in front of the U.S. embassies, demonstrating and protesting against this what's so-called new American vision. Therefore, okay, it is at the end of the day, it is an statement, but it is reflect that still there is a huge pressure on these regimes not to go further with this unjust plan, which is undermining first the Palestinian rights, but it's also destabilizing the whole region, because still the Palestinian conflict is representing the central or the main conflict in the region. The occupation here is one of the main roots of instability and violence and turmoils in the region. Therefore, I don't think we should not minimize the effect of such meetings or statements, even if it is only at the end of the day a statement representing 58 countries with the huge economical, political, and geostrategical impact on the ground.
The problem with the impact ground is also not just the kind of fight that those in Gaza are fighting on a daily basis for the basic rights to exist without the kind of fear that they will be gunned down, mowed down in Israeli attacks. But there's an economic cost to it also. Just recently, Israel blocked Palestinian agricultural exports that were taking place through Jordan. Now, this is affecting the economy somewhat like $88 million. It comes at a very bad time. Is this to put more pressure on the Palestinian leadership to come to the table, to at least start some kind of a conversation?
Yes, true. This is one of the tools used to exercise more pressure on the Palestinian leadership in Gaza and in the West Bank to come the bad, what's so-called Paris Agreement or Paris Economical Treaty 1994, which kept the Palestinian economy as an next to the Israeli economy. We cannot be free with this kind of economical agreements. But we are expecting at the same time from the official Palestinian leadership to take an action as a counter action to this step by stopping first all kind of imports from the Israeli territories, which is representing a huge market for the Israeli territories. This is the second market after the US and United States, in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And second, to call for ending this what's so-called Paris Economical Agreement between the PA and this is the best chance, this is the best moment to get rid of this agreement.
Okay. All right, Dr. Basem Naim, unfortunately, we've run out of time there, but thank you for speaking to us, giving us your view on the analysis here. With that, we will be ending the show. We will see you tomorrow with a new episode. Till then, goodbye.